So students also are motivated, but I think that one thing to note is that some students are here, for example, their parents want them to study in Australia and go to university. So perhaps some of the younger students are not as motivated as some of the students in a general English course. Okay, so let's look at content and approach. So general English, like an EAP, there are 4 skills, grammar and vocabulary. The vocabulary, of course, will be different because it's for a different purpose. For example, social language, phrasal verbs, natural language that you might hear out and about. But it's often language driven and level driven. And some of the topics, if we think about, I looked in one of the general English books. So the natural world, travel, shopping, that type of thing. But and some of the texts might be newspaper articles, travel shows, radio broadcasts. But if we go to EAP, we also have 4 skills, vocabulary and grammar, but we can say that the emphasis is on reading, writing, and research, and that's something that's quite different between general English and EAP. In EAP, we'll have the simulation of learning and teaching at university, and a lot of focus on the culture of learning in Australia or on a specific university. For example, I teach it at Unswell with the University of New South Wales, and many of the course materials focus on what happens at UNSW. So for example, we look at the UNSW Learning Center and teach students that is a resource that they can access. Students also may have UNSW lectures, and we'll look at some of those and talk about how they can cope with these specific lectures. There are also some other materials that we use. The topics are field specific, so topics that may be useful for engineers, for example, and they're authentic academic texts, as I said, not all of them, but at the higher level, the depth level, we do use a lot of academic texts, and lots of emphasis on critical thinking and tasks as well, authentic type tasks, and we'll look at that a little bit later. Okay, so we've talked about some of the differences between general English and EAP. So let's now adopt an EAP mindset, and let's think about what type of task will students need to do at university, and what skills or attributes will they need to succeed in these tasks. And if we think about these things, I think that we can better put ourselves in the shoes of our students and think about how, what might be difficult for them, and also help our students to see the end goal. Okay, so let's start with speaking. The reason I want to talk about speaking is if you're teaching general English or any course, you're already doing probably a lot of speaking in your course. You have a communicative approach, and yeah, so let's look at some tasks that students might have to do at university, and this is based on the research that I did with some students who had done our course and then gone later on to uni. So this is what they told me. So can you think for a minute, and if you want to jot this down, which of these activities do you think your students in your general English course might be prepared to do? And when I say transactions on campus, what I mean about that is, for example, going to IT and asking them how to hook up to Wi-Fi. Communication with tutors and lecturers might be asking questions after a lecture, or perhaps having a consultation. Okay, so why might students find these activities difficult? Okay, when I asked students what they found difficult about these topics, often it had to do with the fact that perhaps didn't feel confident. Sometimes they said in their EAP course perhaps is quite controlled, but when they go to uni, they're having to speak more spontaneously, really think on their feet. So these are some of the things that we can work on in class. Okay, so how can we prepare students for these tasks? And the first thing, as I said before, is a communicative classroom. So the more communicative we can make our classrooms in all aspects. So for example, if we're doing writing, involving speaking in that. If we're doing reading, discussing the reading together, then we will better prepare our students to use English as their language for attending university and accessing their education. And I just want to note that this can be challenging sometimes if you have a class who is mostly monolingual. Sometimes our students may come from all the same countries, so it can be tempting for them to speak their own language. But if we encourage them and make them feel comfortable in their classroom, then yeah, this will make it easier for them to really slip into English mode. Okay, so in addition to making the class communicative, as you would in general English, as you would do in any course, simulations of these activities. So what do I mean by this? Okay, so we said before that students will do a lot of group tests, and I was really surprised in my research how many activities they actually had to do in groups, and they were assessed on in groups. So for example, students could do a task-based project. So there's one project that we do in my course where students have to develop a social marketing campaign, and they need to, of course, come up with a problem and then think of a way to address the problem. And then after they design the campaign, they need to present the campaign. And so that's a really good example of a group project which very much simulates what they might do at university. Discussions, task-based discussions, presentations, according to some research from our school, a very large proportion of our students are having to do presentations even just in the first semester, and some of these are group projects. So presentations feature quite prominently in many EAP programs. Consultations, this is just consulting with students perhaps about their writing one-to-one, and I think many schools also do this in EAP programs. Okay, so when we're teaching speaking or doing these types of programs, activities, you'll want to identify the sub-skills required of the tasks. So for example, analyzing, what is our end goal? What are we trying to do when we give a presentation? In a task-based project, what's the end goal? And students need to also do that in their group. Brainstorming of ideas, evaluating ideas. In an EAP course, you'll be teaching students how to manage discussions. So for example, having a leader, asking questions, agreeing and disagreeing, that kind of language. Supporting opinions with evidence was something that some of my research participants said was very useful for them, something they learned from our discussion groups. Body language and eye contact as well, for example, when giving presentations. Okay, so we've talked about speaking, signposting, sorry. So when giving a presentation, students will learn about how they can signpost to their audience that they're moving to the next point. Okay, so listening tasks and difficulties. So what's the difference between a general English listening and an EAP listening? I think one of the main differences is the length. So before students go to university, they're not perhaps used to listening to someone talk for an hour. So the lectures are much lengthier than general English. In general English, they may be, for example, watching a travel program or listening to a radio broadcast, maybe listening to a dialogue as well, which maybe will be less common, of course, in a lecture. Students in an EAP course will also be encouraged to take notes. So what are some difficulties? Well, of course, the length of the lecture would be difficult. Students need to be able to concentrate for quite a lengthy amount of time. Also, accent can be difficult. So for that reason, many EAP courses try to feature accents of different professors and tutors. Another thing that could be difficult is the fact that not every lecture is well planned. So lectures may have segues into different topics and then come back to the main topic. So this can be confusing for students if they're not used to hearing this. So what EAP activities might you do in a course? Well, teaching students about active listening. So for example, what you can do before you listen. So preparing, so university students can prepare for lectures. We can also teach students about, as I said, signposting before, and that's something that can transfer between giving presentations and listening to lectures. We can also teach students how to be proactive when they're practicing listening at home. So for example, listening to a bit and then stopping it and then summarizing in their mind what they actually heard. And also some post lecture types of activities reflecting on the listening. And fortunately, at university, some of the lectures are recorded. So that's something you could also tell students, but they can't rely on that. Practice note-taking is really important, and there are a lot of activities in many EAP courses which do that. Okay, so let's look at reading now. So I want you to think now, just for a moment, what's the purpose of reading at university? How do we read at university? And why can reading be difficult for students? Sorry, I can see I have a typo on my slide. Okay. So the purpose of reading at university is to expand your information of a topic or to develop your understanding. So when you're at university, you often have a reading list. And so you're building your knowledge about a topic. And then with that knowledge, you may do assignments, you may discuss. You're building your base of knowledge even for your career. But another way that we use reading is we support our research. So students often have quite lengthy assignments, written assignments, or they may have presentations. And in order to do the research, there are a number of different reading skills that they may have to do. So for example, first of all, they need to know what's out there, what are some different sources. So they need to be able to do a literature search and need to know how to use keywords to do that. Then, of course, they'll have to select which sources that they will even choose to look at that are relevant to their topic. Then they may skim them to see, oh, yes, is it relevant, is it not relevant? And then after that, they may choose which information will support their own ideas. So it's really quite a complicated process, but hopefully in an EAP course, that's something that students will be able to learn, and they will develop their skills in that capacity. Text, in terms of text, students will read course books, academic journal articles, case studies, reports, and these reports may include a lot of visual material, graphs. For example, they'll have to read course outlines, and in some faculties, they might read newspapers and magazine articles. Okay, so let's just have a look at this text, and I want you to think for a minute, why may some academic texts be difficult for EAP students? Okay, so if we look at this text, so what's difficult about this text? Well, first of all, some of the sentences are quite long. Students may also be unfamiliar with some of the terms. You notice also there's some referencing. So IWMI 2006. Okay, so in EAP, texts are longer than in general English at university. Number of pages. denser language, complex sentences including noun phrases, use of referencing, as I pointed out before, citations, unknown vocabulary. Students may also have a slow reading speeds. They're not used to, for example, in their English course, reading 5 pages of text. And at university, of course, we know that they may be reading 20 pages of one particular text. And also knowing which reading strategy to use for different texts. So do they actually need to read the whole article, or can they just read the abstract or the introduction and the conclusion to get a main idea of the text? Okay, so how can we work with written text in EAP classroom? I wrote beyond comprehension because at university, we're not just reading for understanding the main ideas. We may be looking at some other things. So let's look at some of the skills. This is a particular text. It's called Water Quantity Uses and Over-Extraction. So let's just think about how we could deal with this. And I put some reading sub-skills here. So when students get this text, the first thing they might do is look at the title and think about, okay, what does this mean? Water quantity, uses, and over-extraction. And they may even need to think about, what does over-extraction mean? So too much, extracting too much water. And they might make some predictions. And when they survey their text, they would look at the different components. So I'm looking at the text now, and I can see that there are some graphs. So they could look at the graphs to get an idea of what the text is about. There are also headings, so they can look at the different headings. And we can clearly see that it is referenced as well. There's quite a long reference list. We can also look at the source, and the source is from the Business Management for Sustainable Environment from the MBT program at UNSW. So in this way, they can get an idea of the author's purpose because they can see that it has to do with sustainable environment. Okay. So within this, with this text, there are some different activities, and I'm not going to go through all of them, but as you can see, when you work with a text in an EAP program, it's not something that only lasts for a short part of the lesson. Our reading skills lesson is actually 2 hours, but then we go back to the text again and we develop the text, and we'll look at that in just a moment. Here's just some other things. Inferring author's view. So what is the author's opinion towards the topic? Inferring the author's purpose. Why did the author write the article? And noting text organization. So students will note that this particular text is divided into different parts. A general context, the Australian context, and then looking forward. So the focus is very much on water scarcity and the fact that it may become worse because of different factors that are mentioned at the end of the text. Use of cohesive devices is another thing that we might look at. Lexical chains. Students can also summarize the reading. And text response. So I think this is a very important thing because, as we talked about at the beginning, one of the purposes of a text is to develop your understanding of a topic. So students can summarize the text and then give their view towards the topic. Okay, so in addition to just understanding a text and working through looking at the purpose, looking at the main ideas, looking at the structure, we can also work with the text for language. So if we look here, one thing that we can do with the text is to look at vocabulary, and this teaches students that they don't have to look up every single word. So if you look at the sentence about changed climatic conditions, you can see that the word in bold is ramifications. So students are asked to look at that sentence, the word in context, to think about what does it mean. And sometimes students are reticent to do this at first. They want to get out their dictionary, but after a while, students can see that it's very useful and they can read more quickly by doing this. Some other things that we may look at when we are exploiting a text for language are flow of ideas, for example, theme and rhyme, noticing use of citation. So for example, that we use the family name and the year for citation. Now this text was actually used for its functional language for cause and effect. So if you can look at the sentence here, there's a good example of cause-effect language, so lead to, and students can identify the cause and effect. And there are some exercises where students have to go through the text and find more examples of this. Students will also build vocabulary on the topic. So for example, water scarcity, over allocation, drought. Okay, so let's look at what we've done so far. So we've exploited a text for language. We're exploiting a text for language as support for writing. So the first thing we did was we looked at the text, and we exploited it for the purpose and the meaning, so students understand the text. And then we've exploited it for language. What might happen next is we might have some further language work and have another model text. So in this case, there is actually another model text about a different problem dealing with water. So actually water pollution. And students look at this in the context of a problem solution essay, and they identify different features. But of course, we're still using the language of cause and effect. And then after that, students may write. So produce a text on the content of the reading or the language studied, or both. Okay, so now we've talked about reading. Let's look at writing. So we've already looked at how reading affects writing, and let's look at some other things. So what types of writing will students need to do at university? And as you can see, there's quite a long list, and they may vary from faculty to faculty. And when we look at this list, we might ask ourselves, well, how can I possibly teach all of these, different task types? If you're teaching general EAP course, what you will be doing instead are teaching some general writing skills that hopefully students can transfer and transform when they go to university. So let's think of the topic of water scarcity and think about looking at it in terms of a problem and a solution. So imagine that students were asked to write about the problem of water scarcity in Australia and to give solutions. So if students had to do that, what would they actually need to be able to do in terms of writing to answer that question? So think about that just for a moment. Okay, so I've made a list here. Okay, so first of all, students would need to be aware of the purpose of why are they writing. So we would give them context. So for example, they're writing for a professor. And they need to know the genre. So they would think, okay, well, this is a problem solution essay. So I'm probably going to use cause effect language. They would analyze the question so they know exactly what to do. So if we said the problem with water scarcity in Australia, then they would need to include that limiting word in their planning. They would brainstorm and plan. Then they would write. And then we hope they will edit. Some students forget that stage, but we can remind them of that. So some other things, well, students need to be able to write sentences. So they need a control of different sentence types. They need to know how to write a paragraph. So students should know that they will be putting topic sentences, supporting details, concluding sentences. Cohesive devices are important, transition signals and reference words. Academic style. So that's another thing that we teach in EAP is the difference between, for example, an informal style and a more academic style. And that both of them, of course, are fine, but it depends on the context. So our students will be learning to write in a more academic way. Functional language for the genre, as we talked about before. And if students were asked to use a number of different source texts, then they will need to know how to identify the information that could support their ideas, how to paraphrase, how to summarize, and then how to reference correctly. And just one thing I want to say about that is students often learn how to use specific referencing conventions. So we use Harvard, but then students, if they don't use this in their faculty, then they can transfer their knowledge of how to be systematic in the referencing and transfer that to a new style, just as we had to do by following the referencing guide. Okay, so some teachers have said to me when they come to EAP, well, how do I teach students how to write? That's so much. Well, the first thing I want to say before we talk about developing writing skills is, I'll just go back on the slide. This is quite a lot. There are a lot of different sub-skills here. You're not expected to teach all of these at the same time, and in, just 1 or 2 weeks. This is a scaffolded process. So for example, in intermediate level EAP, you'll probably be working with paragraphs. So for example, you might write a cause-effect paragraph, or you might write an argument paragraph explaining the 3 advantages of a particular thing. So you are building up student skills, but hopefully at the end, students will be able to do these different things with their writing. Okay, so let's move back to developing writing skills. So I asked a student yesterday, my course is actually finishing this week. My students will be off to university in 4 weeks. And I asked them to think about some of the different topics we discussed and what they learned in our course. And one girl said, well, what I really like is that we were writing regularly. And because we were writing regularly, we were improving, and they really enjoyed the fact that they were getting feedback on their writing. So in your EAP course, students probably will be writing regularly. My students write every week and get feedback every week. So what we need to do is to help students develop the writing process. So understanding why they're writing, encouraging them to brainstorm before they start writing. So thinking of ideas and what they can actually write. Then they will write a plan, write, edit, and then redraft, so they can get the feedback and then improve on the writing. And I just want to mention that we can go back to what we talked about before in a communicative classroom. So many of these activities students can do in pairs or in groups. And my students often tell me, oh, we enjoy discussing the ideas because we get more ideas with more than one person. So it's quite a good process, and students learn to talk to other people about their ideas to get more information and exchanging different views. Okay, so after students write something, we give feedback, so targeted feedback. And that's another thing that a teacher I was talking to yesterday, she said when she started teaching EAP, she didn't know how to mark the paper. She didn't know what feedback would be useful. So my advice would be to focus on the area of instruction. So if students were writing the problem solution, we would look at cause-effect language. We would look at solutions and evaluation of solutions if that's something that we had worked on in class. And of course, other areas that you had worked on previously. So if I think that's week 2 of our program, we'll be looking at topic sentences, be looking at the structure of an introduction. You don't want to overwhelm students with too much feedback. Because they're learning, and we want to encourage them to improve and to take risks. And I just want to mention peer and self-feedback are very important. And in my course, we do writing workshops. So that's working with students' texts and being able to identify other students' mistakes, because you might be making the same types of mistakes. And I found that to be really interesting activity for students, and interesting for me as well. And a good way to build students' writing skills. And I just put a resource here, Longman Academic Writing Series, Levels 1 to 4. This is a really useful book if you're just starting with EAP. Okay, so let's move on a bit. I still have quite a bit of content, but I'm going to speed up a bit. So another perhaps characteristic of an EAP course is fostering learning or autonomy. So as we know, students are going from EAP to their tertiary course, and they're going to have to be independent and do their tasks, do their activities by themselves. So here's a list of things that we'll want students to that we want to do in our EAP classes. So developing study competence. So we can teach students about, for example, planning their assignments, analyzing their assignments so they know exactly what they have to do. And we develop study competence throughout the course, introducing students to resources, so showing them books that they might be able to use to improve their own skills, but letting them make a choice at what's most effective for them. Encouraging self-reflection, so asking students, for example, some teachers at my school, they have students set weekly goals. After they set the weekly goals, at the next week, they look through the goals and talk about, well, did I achieve these goals? Do I want to change my goals? So getting students to think about, activities they've engaged in and how they might go about doing things differently. Also with their writing. So before I have a consultation with students, I often ask them, how do you think you did on your writing? Do you think you improved? Is there an area you want to work on? And then gradually handing over more control to students. And I just referenced at the bottom, Alexander, Argent, and Spencer. In their book, they have a really nice Klein of control, where they talk about how the teacher gradually hands over control to students. Okay, so I'd like to go on to some tips now. And I just have three very general tips about teaching EAP. Okay, so the first tip that I like to give, and I think this is the same for any course, is know the materials, know the context of the course. So if you're going to teach any course, you'll go over and see, what are the 5 chapters or 5 units I'm going to teach, what are the topics, and what are the aims? What do students need to be able to do at the end of different lessons? And especially with some EAP courses, especially at the depth level, there is a lot of assessment, and so you need to know what types of assessment there are, and how is each lesson scaffolded so that students will be able to do well on the exam at the end. Okay, I just put this here. I think this is a really good resource. This is something you can show students, but something that you can use yourself to help you learn about the context of the students. So this is from the UNSW Learning Center, and it's available to students actually it's available to anyone. So if you don't know, for example, about critical review and you're not sure and you're teaching this to students, then you can look at and see what tips they have and what tips are available. So just doing a lot of, some research and reflective thinking about what you did at university, but also thinking about how you're going to convey that information within your course. So really know that course. Help students make connections. So students want to know why they're doing activities. So it's important to establish relevance. So we need to make the content and activities relevant. And I would say in the courses you're going to teach, especially if you're in an English language center, then a university English language center, then the curriculum will have been carefully planned and scaffolded to achieve particular aims. So it will be relevant, I believe. But in your course, you can link it to previous experience. So think about what have students done before that might help apply to this activity. Perceived present worth. So why is it worth doing this activity? How is it going to help me? And seeing links between different courses or components of your course. So for example, in my course, students do a discussion assessment task, but in all of our discussions, we talk about the fact that, this will help you for your discussion task, or the discussion in that students have to lead at the end of their presentation also is very similar to the discussion test. Summarizing, students can summarize after they do a listening, they can summarize after they do a reading. It's a really useful skill they can do in different components of the course, but also something that they'll do at university. So future usefulness, so for example, the fact that students will do presentations at university, you could show them the Learning Center website and say, look, you know, the university is giving this information because you're going to do these activities there. Presenting models of success, the reason I put that there is because for example, using students writing in a workshop is showing and pointing out what was good about the writing and showing that students are improving. Okay, and my third tip is mix it up, and I wrote when appropriate. You do need to stick to the aims and the content of a course. There was something really interesting in the EAP Essentials, which is on my reference list, where a teacher had a task in an intermediate course, and she read the text and she thought, oh, it's too difficult, so she adapted the text, but she really needed to stick to that text because it was a denser text than the one she actually chose. It had examples of academic language, and that was actually the aim of the text. So you need to stick to the aims and the content, but occasionally you can vary the way you present the material and the activities. So it might be better just to learn the, learn the course. So after doing the course a while, but you can mix things up because we know that when we're attending a class, if you're doing the same thing the same way every single time, it can get really boring. So for example, I use academic warmers. The picture that is on the screen, this is an example of my students doing a modified version of Backs to the Board. So some of the vocabulary before about water shortage, I could write those words on the board, and then the girl in white, she's actually explaining those words to the other students, and they're guessing the words. So this was a nice revision activity that I like to do before students write, because students can recall the text and the ideas in the text, then use the vocabulary in the writing. And we can also talk about word form as well. And I just put some other ideas here. So if you have a book without pictures, you can use visuals, get them from Google, go on and find some images or a little introductory YouTube video. A lot of teachers like to use technology, Kahoot, for example, to do a bit of revision. Movement, you can have students stand up and talk, for example, rather than just sitting down all the time. Student-generated content, what I meant by that is if you tell students what the topic of the week is, they can go out and find out about water shortage themselves, bring an article in, and then exchange the information they got. One teacher I know, she has students go to the Conversation online and find some examples of articles to deal with that topic and exchange ideas at the beginning of every week. Okay, so finally, professional development. Okay, so I hope after I've given these ideas that you are still interested in teaching EAP. So here's just some ideas I have if you want to start teaching EAP, if you are not teaching it already, or if you are a recent, if you've just recently moved into teaching EAP. What can you do? So first of all, observe an EAP course. If you have an EAP program at your school, ask to observe an EAP course and watch it, and maybe take some notes and think about, is this something that I'd like to do? Ask some questions. Become familiar with EAP materials and resource books. I mentioned Longman Academic Writing Series before. I think I was looking at this a lot when I started teaching EAP to see what types of things students will have to do with their writing. I like using English for Academic Purposes. It's a really nice website. Students can use it as well. If you have a choice and you maybe have not been teaching very long, you may want to teach a pre-dep course at an intermediate level so that you're get your head around some of maybe the more difficult language points that are taught. and then move your way up, just like, you know, the students do. So I think a lot of teachers find this to be quite a satisfying pathway for themselves. Network and share current practice. So I mentioned UECA before. There was a UECA PD Fest in, I believe it was in May. Really great. I saw a lot of really good sessions, and I put the link here, and you can go on and look at some of the PowerPoints. And of course, AusLT. A lot of the teachers on AusLT, or some of the teachers, are EAP teachers, so you can go on there. In the past, there weren't a lot of training programs for EAP teachers, but now there's the Sydney University course, EAP for ELT professionals, is being offered now. I believe it starts in August. And I think that really sounds like a great opportunity to find out more about EAP and learn some skills and strategies in a longer time than just a 1-hour webinar. Okay, so I think that's all that I would like to talk about for now. And Sophie, you said that we could have a bit of question time. We only have about 5 minutes. So if you have a question, could you please type it in?
Great, thanks, Meredith. I can see that there are some questions coming through already. Someone has said, do you use a course book for your courses?
Okay, so we don't have an official course book. Well, we have a course book, of course, but it's written in-house. So it's not a published course book. It's written by course writers at our center. And it's very much in response to what the university wants our students to know and to be able to do at the end of the DEP course.
Yeah, I think that's pretty common practice at a lot of the university centres. Any other questions? Somebody has said, is there a certificate awarded? For example, Cert 4 in EAP. Whoever has asked that question, do you mean for the Sydney University course, or more generally, if you could just clarify that? I'll just move on to the next question and then come back to that one. Someone said, is EAP only sessional, or does it run all year long?
Yeah, from my experience, it's more sessional. There's a lot more work, as I said, 20 weeks before the intake of university. So things get really busy. And I think this is probably common around Australia in August and March. It gets very busy, and there's a big need for lots of teachers. But there are foundation programs as well. So that's another opportunity. But there are just a few, at my center, there are a few low terms, and usually in June, and also, I believe, February.
I think that's common in most centres, certainly at the university centres in Australia. The person who asked about the certificate has clarified. So they mean for the actual course that you teach, the DEP course, do they get a certificate awarded?
Oh, if you teach the course, no.
But it's something you can put on your, perhaps.
Yeah. Oh, yes. Well, the students they go on to university, so it's direct entry. They get a certificate at a certificate ceremony, but the important thing is that it's deemed that they have fulfilled the requirements, the English language requirements to go to university.
Okay, great. What's the best way to help general English students have a good transition to EAP?
That's an interesting question. I think, well, taking a course is a good way, but I suppose developing their language in general, speaking as much as possible, reading as much as possible. TED Talks are nice and can be accessible at a certain level, and intermediate students, but most students choose to go on to the academic pathway if that's the direction they want to go. But improving their English as much as possible and then moving on to an EAP program, I would say.
Okay, great. Somebody has asked about theme and rhyme.
Okay.
Do you think you have time to answer a question on that in a
It's
couple of
just
minutes?
looking
So
at
they've
the
just said,
development of ideas.
how do you
Yeah,
use it
looking at
in
the
EAP?
okay. So it's just looking I don't have time to explain it in depth, but it's looking at the way ideas flow in a text. So for example, I don't have an example. A sentence might end with an idea and then start with the same idea. So there's a link between the ideas in the text.
And do you
So
explicitly
sometimes
teach that in your course?
um, we don't. We do have a section called theme and ream. We look at it, but whenever I'm looking at a paragraph, I might ask students to think about how the sentence following the topic sentence is connected by idea and language, and then to look at the next one. So thinking about what the connection. So it could be a word, like a transition signal or a reference word, but it could just be the idea, like a lexical link. So yeah, we do look at that to look at cohesion.
Great. Somebody's asked, is there something that university centres look for in particular when they're hiring teachers?
I would say for that one, you might know too, Sophie, but I think for intermediate level, perhaps, let me just clarify. So maybe for higher level, like a depth course, like the one I'm teaching, a good foundation of language. So being able to look at a student's writing and be able to identify where they've gone wrong. So you need to be able to, understand how to explain to students that you need a dependent clause and an independent clause. You need to be able to give students advice for writing. I think having a good foundation of language and being able to explain that to students, because we're not teaching grammar explicitly at the very high levels, but as I said, you can enter at a lower level, at an intermediate level course, and that's the way I would probably go. So don't worry that you don't have too much enough experience to do it. You don't need a master's to start teaching an EAP course, in my opinion.
Okay. So,
but for the very high levels, you do really need to be confident with language. But the fact that you've come onto the webinar and are thinking about it, I think that's great. And so you can start looking at some of the sources I suggested. So even if you go to an interview knowing what EAP is and what's the purpose of EAP and some of the things you might do, I think that's would be an advantage for you.
Yeah, I think that's really good advice. There's a lot of thank yous coming through and very well presented, really useful. So thank you very much. There was also a very wise comment that came through from another person who I know who's also an experienced EAP teacher. And they just said that EAP can be really overwhelming for new teachers and that mentoring new teachers is really important. Would you agree
Yeah,
with
I
that?
agree. I very, very much agree with you. I was actually mentoring some of our new teachers at our center, and yeah, I think it's really important. And I just want to point out that's actually in your direct entry program best practice guide. That centers should have an orientation for for new teachers, and should have mentors. So hopefully your center will have one. But if you don't have one, then maybe find a friendly teacher to bounce ideas off and to ask questions. I mean, I find in my center people are very friendly and really willing to share ideas. So yeah, so just ask someone, but hopefully you will have a mentor. I agree, it's very important.
Okay, great. Thank you. And yeah, the Direct Entry Program's Best Practice Guide that Meredith just mentioned is an English Australia publication. It's just been updated in 2017, and if you work for a member college, you can get access to that through our website. So we'll probably finish up there, Meredith, but there's a lot of very positive comments coming through on the feed here, which I can share with you later. But on behalf of English Australia, I'd just like to say thank you very much. It was a fantastic introduction to the context of EAP in Australia, and you shared some really wise and helpful tips for new teachers. So thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much. Thanks everyone for listening.
Yeah, thanks to everyone for coming as well.